You knew not to call mom at work unless it was an actual emergency. You knew which problems to handle yourself and which ones were serious enough to interrupt her day. You learned that distinction early, without anyone teaching it to you, just from watching, from reading the room, from understanding at an age when you shouldn't have had to understand that the adults around you were already at capacity. You came home to an empty house. You made your own snack. You did your homework. You figured out what was for dinner, and sometimes you were the one who made it. Not because anyone asked you to, but because that was what the situation required, and you were the one who was there. You knew your parents were stressed before they said a word. You could read it in how the front door closed, in the quiet at the dinner table, in the particular way someone's shoulders looked after a long shift. You registered all of it. You adjusted. You stopped asking for certain things. You stopped adding to the pile. You were told your whole life that you were mature for your age, responsible, easy, self-sufficient, so good at handling things on your own. Nobody told you that was supposed to be a childhood you were living, not a position you were filling. If any of that is familiar, the empty house after school, the early self-sufficiency, the instinct to manage rather than be managed, psychology has a specific name for what happened to you. And once you have it, a lot about your adult life is going to make a different kind of sense. The easy version of growing up too fast is that it builds character, that independence is a gift, that children who handle things on their own become adults who handle things on their own. And isn't that exactly what you want? Your early self-sufficiency was praised. It was treated as evidence that you were exceptional. You were the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who didn't cause problems, didn't need things, and just dealt with whatever came. What that framing left out is the developmental cost of carrying adult weight before the nervous system was built to hold it. The research on what actually happens, long-term, to children who grew up too fast is more specific than most people in this position have ever been told. Developmental psychologists have a term for what happens when a child is placed in an adult role, physically, emotionally, or both. It is called parentification. Instrumental parentification is the visible kind, managing the household, making meals, taking care of younger siblings, handling logistics that belong to an adult. Emotional parentification is the quieter kind, being the person a parent confides in, managing a parent's emotional state, becoming the stable presence in a home that didn't have one. Most children who grew up too fast experience some form of both, and what the research shows is that the effects don't end when the circumstances do. They become the architecture. The nervous system of a parentified child learns very early to scan for problems, to identify what a room needs before anyone says a word, to be competent, reliable, and self-contained, not as a choice, but because the environment required it before the child had any alternative. That training doesn't stop when the situation changes. It becomes the default. You still read rooms the moment you walk into them. You still know who's uncomfortable before they show it. You still manage things quietly rather than announcing them. You still find it easier to give than to ask. Not because that's your preference, because for most of your childhood, that was not a personality trait. It was how you kept things running. In 2007, psychologist Lisa Hooper published a comprehensive review of parentification research in the Journal of Mental Health Counseling, drawing from multiple studies conducted over 2 decades on children who took on adult roles during development. The review found that an estimated 25 to 30% of children experience significant levels of parentification. That is roughly 1 in 4, not a rare edge case, not a small minority. 1 in 4 children growing up in the households of the 1980s and 1990s, many of them in homes that looked functional from the outside, in families that weren't in crisis, in situations where nobody thought anything was wrong. What the research documented about long-term outcomes was specific. Children who experienced significant parentification showed higher early competence, more responsible, more capable, more attuned to others than peers their age. They also showed consistent patterns in adulthood, hypervigilance in social environments, persistent difficulty accepting care or help from others, a deep tendency to prioritize everyone else's needs before their own, and an often unexamined belief that their value is directly connected to how useful they are. You are capable and reliable and good at managing because you were trained to be, in conditions that didn't give you much of a choice. The competence is real. So is the cost it came with. Here is what growing up too fast actually built in you. You are one of the most dependable people most people in your life have ever known. Not because someone modeled it for you, because you built it yourself, in an empty house, at an age when other kids were still being reminded to tie their shoes. And in doing so, you developed a kind of reliability that people who had easier childhoods simply do not carry in the same form. You are genuinely loyal, not as a performance, because loyalty was not a value you absorbed from a distance. It was something you practiced every day from the time you were small, in the form of staying, showing up, and not abandoning the people and situations that needed you, even when you had nothing left to give. You read people accurately, not from suspicion but from training. You spent your formative years in environments where missing a signal had real consequences. That skill didn't leave when the circumstances changed. In a world full of adults who regularly miss what's happening right in front of them, the ability to read a room before anyone speaks is not a small advantage. It is a serious one. The version of you that grew up too fast paid a price that was never yours to pay. But it also deposited something that could not have been built any other way. Not the hard way, this specific way. Through this particular kind of early weight, carried before you had the shoulders for it. There is something that needs to be said plainly about the 90s kids who handled too much. You grew up in a decade that was optimistic in a way that left certain things unexamined. The economy was moving. Parents were working. The cultural message was that capable, independent kids were fine. That self-sufficiency at a young age was something to be proud of, something that reflected well on everyone involved. Nobody was lying. They just weren't asking the right questions about what it cost. You came home to quiet houses and made them feel occupied. You absorbed adult tension and processed it privately so nobody had to deal with yours. You held things together that were never yours to hold, and you held them well, and the world mostly didn't notice because you made it look like it wasn't difficult. That child who figured everything out alone, who read the room at 8 years old, who knew not to add to the pile, who became reliable before anyone had the right to ask. They didn't disappear when you got older. They're still in there, still scanning, still managing, still making sure everything is handled before they let themselves rest. What they may not have been told often enough is that what they did was genuinely hard, that the quiet competence they built was not evidence of having needed nothing. It was evidence of having given everything, long before anyone thought to ask if they had anything left. If this describes something you lived through but never had the exact words for, subscribe. The next video goes somewhere your brain is already going after this one. And if this landed, you'll recognize the next one immediately.